So let's jump into bark, leaves, and grasses. So on the handout, you'll see there's some images of trees, grass, and different types of bark. And then I have listed some tips, and we're just going to kind of go through that before we start some painting today. I think a lot of painting, a lot of drawing has to do with observation. Like that's a good, like observation is key. Observation is important. You can see in that handout, observation is that first thing we're talking about. And so I want to kind of bring up this tree in the handout. And so when I talk about observation, it's talking about like taking a moment to notice. Even when you're not doing this exact image, you're doing just a tree from your imagination, it's important to observe an actual tree, right? Think about an actual tree. That helps us with our painting, right? And so noticing the color, noticing the light, the shape, the lines. So looking at this tree here, I know when we think about painting or drawing a tree, we think about the trunk being brown, right? But if we look at this tree trunk here, you'll notice there's more than just brown in it, right? If we look closely, you'll see a little bit of pink. We'll see a little bit of orange. There's a little red in there. There's some gray, a little yellow. There's a lot of color that's inside that bark. And so an example I have in there is like several different styles of bark here that are kind of zoomed in. And so if you take a moment to look at each of those pieces of bark, you can see there's more than just one color, right? There's a huge variety of color that's inside just that bark. And so it's important to kind of observe that and think about those colors that are seen because it does help us when it comes to painting that bark. One of the things that you'll find, and we'll go over it quite a bit, is that when it comes to watercolor, you're doing layer upon layer upon layer. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But thinking about what colors you're noticing here really does help when it comes to painting. I'll share, I have a file folder that has a ton of reference images, magazine images and photos that I've collected that help me when it comes to painting. It's not that I'm painting exactly those photos, but I can pull out some images of bark and find kind of that color palette or that shape that I want to work with. It's helpful. Or tree shapes or like different mountain shapes. It's helpful to have those reference photos, even if we're not painting it exactly. So I'm noticing that there's a variety of color in that bark. There's also a variety of color in the tree leaves too. It's not just one shade of green. And it's not just a dark and a light. With this image, you'll see there's like a yellow green. There's a dark like hunter green. There's a pale green, a bright green, but there's also, you're seeing little bits of red in there, right? When we start looking closer, we start seeing that there's more color involved than just green, just one shade of green. We'll also notice when we're looking at the tree that it's not solid, right? We see holes in it where we're starting to see that background. If we were to go outside and look at a tree, we'd see that it's not completely solid. You can see through. You can see some of these branches sticking out. You can see, it's like in some cases, see all the way through it. So it's not that solid piece of color, right? We'll also notice that there's light and shadow, right? We can see that specifically with this trunk. We can tell that the light is coming this direction because the lighter colors are here and here. And we can see that there's a darker shadow on this side because it's being hidden from that sun. So there's darker greens on this side and darker bark here. But one of the things I also want to point out is that you'll notice it's not just light green here and dark green here. It's light green that's mixed in with dark green. Each branch has its own kind of section of leaves. And so you'll see in this section here, there's a lot of light, but there's also some dark speckled in, okay? When it comes to the bark here, you'll see that there's light here on this side and dark on this side, but you'll see in the middle, there's a lot of dark and light that are kind of speckled into each other, right? And I also want to point out when it comes to leaves here, one other thing you may notice is that you don't see an individual leaf, right? You see sections of color, splotches of color. I think sometimes when we try to paint a tree or draw a tree, we think we have to draw each individual leaf and put a lot of detail in it. And the truth is, we don't. We have to give the illusion of leaves there. It's a bunch of leaves. Even looking at this photo of a tree, we don't see the individual leaves. We see those splotches of color. And so kind of paying attention to some of those things. What do you notice about this image? Paying attention to the light and the shadow, paying attention to the color, the overall shape, the lines. It really does help when it comes to the actual painting part. So one of the things that we kind of talked about a little bit a while ago, earlier, is kind of drawing a layout. This really does help when it comes to drawing a landscape or a portrait, thinking about placement and just kind of, yeah, placement mostly, where you want those things to be and what exactly you're wanting in your piece. So if I'm doing this tree, one of the things that I would suggest is using your watercolor pencils. If you have watercolor pencils, definitely pull those out. So I'm using a reddish brown, but know that if you don't have watercolor pencils, using a regular pencil works as well. The benefit of using a watercolor pencil to kind of draw our layout is that it's water soluble. So when you add the water to it, it blends in and adds to your painting. When you're doing a regular pencil to draw your layout, you'll have to erase parts of it as you're painting because that regular pencil will show through that watercolor. And I'm not saying to like you have to do that layout, that drawing, but it really is, it's helpful. And as with everything we're talking about lots of tips and tricks on how to paint here. And you can follow each of these tips and tricks and have a very successful painting, but you can also completely ignore them and still have a successful painting. So I just want to say that again, take what's helpful and definitely ignore the rest, and that's okay. That's good. So to do this tree here and think about these underlying shapes, I'm going to press really hard with my watercolor pencil so you can see it, but know that you don't have to press hard. You want that light drawing. To do those underlying shapes, one of the things I'm going to notice here is that it looks like I have some different shapes here where these branches are going. There's like little circles that we can draw. So to kind of find those underlying shapes just for this tree here, I'm gonna press hard so it's a little easier to see, but know that you can just press lightly with this. So I'm gonna notice those shapes. So I've got my bark here that's going up. And you can see like the branches coming up. I'm just kind of building that a little bit. Right? I'm not doing a whole lot of detail. I'm not adding lots of little branches. I'm thinking about those big main shapes, right? So I've got that bark here, right? That trunk. And then to find those leaves, I'm just going to kind of think about those large shapes, right? So I'm finding those large shapes here and just kind of drawing that in. And you can see I'm like overlapping. Overlapping a little bit. So I've got that basic shape of my tree here. I found those big underlying shapes. And what's going to help now that I have those shapes out, it gives me an idea of where some of those darker colors and those lighter colors are going to be. Again, if the light is coming this direction, right, we're going to have mostly light here, but we're going to have those darker colors towards the bottom, right? And we'll see that as we start doing the painting as well. Okay, so it's finding those underlying shapes. paying attention to the colors that you're wanting to use, and also being able to kind of use your palettes to mix those colors. Even if you just have a pan palette like this, you can mix these colors to create a variety of greens or variety of like wood colors, things like that. And so kind of doing that underlying shape is really helpful, right? Because it gives us kind of that layout and also helps us see that those darker values are going to be here because we've got our sun coming from this direction. That light is coming from this direction. So we've got our lighter colors at the top of these little shapes, and those darker colors are going to be at the bottom, and those darker colors are going to be kind of further away. Now, one of the things that I mentioned, and I will continue to talk about when it comes to watercolor, we're layering. We're putting layer on top of layer on top of layer. And so the thing to think about is we're starting with that lightest color and gradually building up. So this is an example I started earlier, thinking about layers. So you can see here, this is one layer of paint. This is two layers of paint, right? You can see those colors are getting darker, right? And we're getting kind of depth with our wood, right? And this trunk, you can see I did that scumbling technique where we're doing that broken or that sponge mark making to get that depth here. And so you can see all the layers that are inside this bark to create that depth, right? And so the way to do that, to start building those layers, again, it takes time, right? We're waiting for that paint to dry, so it's taking a little time, but it's layering it up. And so what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to start off by taking my watercolor pencil, and I'm just going to do my outline here, right? So if you're doing that tree that we just drew, definitely you can paint on that. But I'm just doing this basic tree shape. And again, I'm pressing harder than I need to, just so it's a little easier to see on camera. But I have that outline there. So what I can do now with my brush is that first layer. Okay? So I'm going to get my brush nice and wet. And I want a really soft, light layer. If we go back to the handout here, you can see there's a lot of colors inside that bark, right? But that lightest color, if I'm doing this bark, that lightest color is going to be that pale pink, right? And here, that lightest color is going to be kind of a pale brown, right? A little tan. And so whatever kind of bark you're doing, whether it's red or yellow, green or brown, you want to think about that lightest color first. And so I'm going to stay with this brown one here. That's a variety of brown, but also has some yellows and reds in it. And I'm going to start with my lightest color. Okay. So getting my paintbrush wet, this is where that palette, mixing palette, comes in handy. So if you have a tray like this, or if you want to use that those sections in your palette, either one is good. But what we want to do is kind of create that base color. So if you're just using a regular pan palette like this that has the pigment in there, what I want to mix is a little bit of brown, a little bit of red, and a little bit of yellow. That's going to get me that really pale color like this. And so I'm going to start off by getting my brush wet and bringing some of that water to my palette here. And then I'm going to start with my lightest color, getting that yellow in, cleaning my brush, getting my brush wet, bringing in a little bit of that red, cleaning my brush, getting it wet, and bringing in a little bit of that brown. And so you can see that's a really pale color, right? A soft color. To get it lighter, we just add more water. To get it darker, we'll add more pigment. We don't necessarily need to add black to make it darker, right? Just adding more pigment. And so what I'm going to do is take my brush, once I've mixed my color and gotten a light color that I like, I'll take my brush and just kind of brush down my tree trunk. And I'm going right along the lines that I've drawn for myself, right? The pigment is only going to go where the water is, right? And so you can see as I'm adding water, I'm kind of touching that mark that my pencil made, and it's blending in to the pigment that I have there. So I've got that kind of base color. Okay. And so that's my one layer. I did a wet on dry, so a really wet brush on a dry paper, right? One of the things that I want to do now is a wet on wet, right? So that first layer, if I'm still thinking my light is coming this direction, right? That means the darker parts of my tree that I'm making are going to be this left side and this left side of the branch. And it's good to think about that branch too, where that light is hitting. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that same color that I made, right? Get my brush on it, maybe add a little more brown to make it like slightly darker. And because my paper is wet, I'm just going to kind of go along where I know the darker color is going to be, that shadow is going to be. And I'm just kind of putting a wet on wet, tapping it, painting it, adding that pigment. You can see it's getting darker. And coming over to my branch, thinking about where that shadow is on my branch and adding that pigment there. So that's basically my first layer, right? Adding that pigment to the darker side, that wet on wet. So I've got that shadow that's starting to appear. Those darker colors are starting to appear on that side where the shadow is. And then I've got some lighter colors here. Now, if you're using a watercolor pencil, again, like you can draw softer, a lighter touch. So it kind of blends in more. I'm doing it heavy for this camera here. But as this dries, you'll get something that looks like this one. So you can see that kind of darker shade on the left and lighter on the right. We've got that first layer. So once that first layer dries, we can come back and add another layer, get it darker. And so you can see with this next image that I have, this is a second layer on top of it. And so you can see that second layer, it's still darker on the left, but I've left some white or lighter colors on the right, right? I didn't cover it completely. And so what that looks like, I'm going to get my brush wet. So for this tree here, I was using some more like grays and browns. So I'm just going to wet that pigment that dried. And I'm going to start covering my branch or my trunk with it. So I'm layering it. And you can see it's starting to get darker, right? I'm adding most of my color, most of my layers to where that shadow is, building it up. And this is called glazing. It's what we talked about last session. Glazing is adding a layer on top of a layer. And so you can see here, that layer that I put on top, that second layer, is darker than that first layer. It's the same color, but it's giving me depth, right? It's giving me shadow. And then the more layers that you put on top, the darker and more detail you'll get. So I'm going to show how to start getting this scumbling look. Right? So again, I'm going to use some of the colors that I made before, the darker browns and the grays and purples, right? And add it to this branch here, this trunk here, so you can kind of see where it's starting. You can see that I've added reds and browns and grays and purples and some greens in there to get that nice range of color. It's helpful to reference those photos for sure, those pictures. So I'm going to get my brush wet and just come over to my darker purples here. So to start getting this look, we're going to remember that scumbling that we did last time, and we're just going to make those marks. And it's just kind of tapping, right? And I know when it's wet, it doesn't really look like anything because it's wet and it looks really defined. But as that water dries and that pigment, you're going to get some really nice blended in coloring. right? As this dries, I can start adding more colors, right? To get that range. I'm thinking, still thinking where that light is hitting, right? That light is coming from this direction. So my lighter shades are going to be on this side. My darker shades are going to be on the opposite side. And again, as each layer dries, I can layer on top of it. We kind of did this a little quickly because I know it takes time for that water to dry, and I wanted to make sure we talked all the way through this. But I do want to encourage you to find some time this week to kind of practice with that bark. But definitely take some time to kind of practice and play around with that scumbling and those layering, those glazing. One of the things I want to point out is that we don't see individual leaves. I know in our mind, when it comes to drawing a tree, we feel like we need to draw those individual leaves, or we feel like we need to paint those individual leaves. But the truth is, we don't see that. We see specks of color, right? We don't see those individual leaves. And so when it comes to painting, we don't have to paint each individual leaf. And so the process that's really helpful when it comes to painting leaves is that scumbling. And if we remember from our demo, when we were learning techniques, talking about techniques, that scumbling is either using that sponge to create this kind of stippled pattern or using that brush in broken marks, right? So that's kind of what we're going to be doing with our leaves today. And again, just like with that bark, we'll be doing layers, building those layers up. So it takes a little time. And I'll reference back our bark here. It's layer upon layer upon layer to kind of build that up. So we can kind of see that bark appearing. And if we look at that handout, you can see, like when I was doing this one, I was paying attention to the colors that I found in this bark, right? And you can see there's so many layers of colors. And so it takes time and layers to kind of get that bark built up. The same is with these leaves. It'll take a little time. If we really spend time looking at this, we notice it's not all one shade of green, right? There are different shades of green in there. And so when it comes to painting, just like painting anything, observation is important. That's an important first step. And so if we look at the leaves here, a couple of things that we observe right off are going to be the varying colors of green, right? We see a lighter green kind of on the top. We see kind of a darker green on the bottom spaces here. We see some midtones. There's probably about 4 different midtones, 3 or 4 different midtones that we see. So it's a variety of greens that we're seeing. And so what we're going to do is kind of mix up some greens to start with. So whether you have the pan palette that already has pigment in there or you created your own, it's good to mix up some greens. Now, because I know that I'm going to be using multiple greens, I'm going to go ahead and start mixing some up. And so I'm just going to take my brush, and if you have a tray with you to start mixing some greens, let's go ahead and do that. With your pan palette, generally they have 2 shades of green. They have a lighter one and a darker one. And so like you don't have to necessarily mix those, but I think it's always good to mix greens and have a variety. You can add some yellow to it and kind of warm it up a little bit. Even a little red or brown or blue can really get us some vibrant greens for sure. And so what I'm going to do to start mixing colors is I'm going to go ahead and put some water in my palette. And I'm just kind of bringing it over with my brush. Okay. And so I'm going to do some 5 different ones here. But I'm going to start, if you're using like a palette that you made, that's good too. I'm going to demo with this pan palette today though. So I'm going to get my brush wet and I'm going to bring over some of that light green. And you can see, like, I'm making sure my brush is wet, and I'm just kind of brushing it across that edge so that green pigment kind of goes into that water. And I'm just going to start by putting some greens in each of my water. And so if you have your palette with you, you want to mix up a couple greens, 2 or 3 greens. Just kind of add that in there. I'm starting with the light green here, because when we're doing lighter colors, we generally need more pigment. If you start off with that darker color, you just need a small amount to start getting dark. All right, so I've got some greens, my light greens here. So what I'm going to do is come and get some of that yellow. I'm going to add that to my first one. And just kind of bring that yellow in. And I'm bringing quite a bit of yellow into that color. And you can see already in what I've mixed how much lighter it is from that regular green. Okay. So I've got some yellow and green here. And this one, I'm going to mix a little yellow with it and go ahead and add a little of my darker color. So just kind of make a couple different shades. You want some lighter tones and some darker tones. And then I'm just going to add some darker greens. To my other colors. And so we can get that variety. I'm just kind of bringing it over and mixing it in. And I want to make sure I've got different shades, right? Some much darker, some much lighter. I'm going to add a tiny bit of brown to this one. And so here I've got a few different shades of green. So this is kind of setting me up for success when it comes to that variety. Okay. So I'm going to move this over a little bit. Okay. So now that I've got my colors mixed, it's going to make it a little easier for me to kind of start building start building those leaves up. And so again, I just want to come back to the leaves here. And you can see, I talked about noticing those different shades of green, right? One thing that we also notice in this picture is where the light is coming from, right? And that's important too when it comes to painting, because that'll show you where the darkest darks are and where the lightest lights are, right? So if we're looking at this image here, we can tell the sun is coming from our top right side. And so the lightest lights are going to be right here. You can see there's some really bright yellows that are in those spaces. Right? So it's good to know that there's what their yellows are. Now we see lighter colors kind of in the mid-tone here too, but the lightest light is right here where that sun is. And so that means the darkest dark is going to be on this side. Okay? And those mid-tones are kind of all throughout. Another thing that we notice is that you can still see some of that sky, that white in the background. It's not a solid green. There's like spaces of color and there's some gaps, right? And so this, when we start building our leaves and our painting, those are some things to kind of keep and pay attention to, right? So if I'm looking at my tree here and I say my sun is right here, beautiful sun. What I'm going to do is make sure that the lightest lights are on this side and the darkest darks are on this side. Mm. So I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to take my small brush here. This is a brush that came in the pan palette. Um, get it nice and wet. So what I want to start doing is laying those light colors down first, right? And the reason we start painting with the lightest color first is that when you start painting darker colors over it, you see those dark colors. But if you paint a light color on top of a dark color, you don't see that light color. It kind of disappears. And so we want that light color first. And so what I'm going to do is take my lightest color and I'm just going to kind of use that scumbling to add it all over most of our tree here. So I'm going to take my brush in my lightest color here and just kind of start adding. You can see I'm just doing that scumbling technique, right? Where it's just adding those dots, right? Those broken pieces. And I'm just kind of adding it all over. Oh. I'm not putting it on the darkest dark part, but I'm making it more concentrated where the light is, my lightest color. Mm. Now, when it comes to watercolor, I've said it in our previous sessions, previous times together, and I'll say it again today, and I'll probably say it next week also. Watercolor is a slow process, and it's because you're waiting in between each layer. You're waiting for that first layer to dry, right? And so after doing that first layer, it'll take a minute before it dries, and we can add that second layer on top of it. So while that's drying, I want to talk a little bit about how I made the tree here. So to do this branch, this tree, this simple tree, you can see that I've got my trunk is pretty solid, but when I came up to do my branches, I just kind of did some broken marks, right? I didn't completely let me do an example here. I'm just going to do regular brown. So when I did my tree, I just started with my trunk. Oh, let me actually move my light here. There. I started with my trunk going down. And then I thought about where those branches are going. I didn't make it go all the way, right? Not all connected, like where everything is connected. I didn't do that, right? And it's because I want some of those light greens to show up. That light green isn't going to show up on top of this dark brown. And so a way to kind of let some of that dark color shine through, but still get that light shade of green is to do broken branches. So instead of doing something like this, we're going to start with that trunk coming up. And then do like broken branches. So it's just thinking about where that branch may come out and doing some broken marks like this. It's not really connecting them, but it's thinking about those marks like here and just kind of picking spots to highlight, right? And so what happens is those lightest lights like we have here start showing up, right? Because again, the lightest colors don't show up on the darkest colors. And so it's important to kind of leave those broken spaces. As I was saying earlier, another way to do that is to leave off that these branches here, leave that off until you're done with the green, and then go back in with that dark brown or yellow brown, red brown, whatever branch color, and make those marks on top of it. So you can do it before like this or after. I'm going to go ahead and pick up some of this color here so we can talk about our next mark making. Are we on time? Okay. So I've got my lightest color down. So what I'm going to do is come over it with my next lightest color, right? So I'm starting with my lightest value, and I'm gradually going to that darker value, right? So I'm just going to pick up some of that color and start adding that on top. Not adding it to that lightest part here where the sun is, but kind of moving back a little bit. Thinking about that mid-tone. And just kind of adding that scumbling in. And you see, I'm not still going into that darkest dark point, but I'm creating that kind of mid-tone here. Layering it up. Another way to kind of get that scumbling, we're talking about using that small brush, is to use a sponge. So a sponge like this that has lots of holes and sections in it, that does like really well also. And so what I'm going to do is just take this, and I'm going to show an example up here on this tree here. But I'm going to take my sponge here, this section that's kind of rough and has different parts. And I'm going to do a darker color so it's a little easier to see. I'm just dipping it in my pigment, right? So I have a little bit on there, and then coming over here and starting it. And you can see it gives us that kind of scumbling mark in a faster way. Doing the brush, I have more control of where I'm putting those colors, but doing this sponge gives me a nice coverage and still gives us those broken marks. Yeah. So there are a couple ways to kind of get those branches. And then as we're building up our branch, right, we can gradually go to those darker and darker colors, right? Those darker values. And you can see as I'm going to each of my colors, I'm kind of mixing it up a little bit. The longer it sits, that water will start separating from that pigment. And so you want to kind of mix it up again so you're getting a nice saturation with your brush. And so it's adding those darker values as we go through. We can see those colors kind of building up, right? That value building up, the lightest lights going into those darker colors until we get to that darkest dark. We can kind of add that in, right? Building that up. Either using our brush or that sponge. And so that's kind of just a quick start into doing tree leaves. That lightest light going into those darker marks so we get that darkest color, right? And then that scumbling using that sponge gets us really nice coverage as well. So when it comes to painting grass, again, we're going to still use those paints today. I have a couple examples here. So this one I think is in the handout is a really great example of a field of grass. Again, that first step, whenever it comes to doing a landscape painting or any type of painting, is observation, right? And so if I look at my picture here, I can see several things right off the bat. I can see that there's a lighter color. There's some midtones, there's some darker colors, and there's some really light marks on top of the dark colors here, right? So when it comes to landscapes, painting landscapes, and it's really important to think about when we're doing grass, is that there's something called atmospheric landscape, right? And so atmospheric landscape is all about like foreground, midground, background, right? The stuff that is closest to us that we're viewing is going to be the darkest dark and the lightest light. And that's because it's closer to us, so we can observe more. The further away it gets, the less saturated it is. So we get those lighter colors, those muted colors, the less detail, right? And so if we look in our image here, we can see we get a lot of the detail of the grass right up here along the bottom of the frame. And that's because it's closer to us. We can see more detail. But the further back it goes, the less detail we see, and it turns more into just a plane of color, a wash of color, right? Another example, you can see like the tree line here, it just looks like a couple different colors, right? But the closer we get to the trees, the more detail we see, the more varying shades of green we see, the more branches we see, right? So the closer it is to us, the more detail, the further away it is from us, the less detail. And you can see here, the darkest darks, the lightest lights, and it loses saturation as it goes further back in the image. What we're going to do is talk a little bit about how to set up the grass, right? How to set up that background. Right? And so I'm still going to be using my shades of green here. And so I'm just, for the sake of our drawing today, I'm going to set up this right here. We'll talk about this being my piece of paper that I'm working on. And so I'm doing my landscape here. That first step is to do a wash of color, right? And so I'm still going to be using my smaller brush today, just for the size here, but any size brush will work. When you're doing a wash of color, sometimes it's helpful having a bigger brush because you can do it faster. But what I'm going to do for my wash of color is I'm going to get my brush wet and then do that lightest color, right? My lightest green. And I'm going to do that wash, right? And so if we remember from doing that techniques a few sessions ago, we're doing that wet on dry, that flat wash, right? And so you can see my landscape here. I'm just doing some of that green, right? That wash right across. I'm not worrying about gradation or value changes. I'm just doing that kind of background color. And again, we're doing that lightest color first, because we can always add dark on top of it, right? And so looking at our image here, right, our example, we can see there's a lot of yellow up at the top, but there's some darker greens here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start building on top of my landscape, my grass here. So I'm just going to add a little bit of yellow to my wash, right? Just on top of that green, and just kind of bring it down. So it's not a whole lot of yellow, but it really lightens up that green that's there. And then just add a little bit darker, just kind of layering that up, right? So we're seeing that gradual transition of color. And this is something that takes a little practice, doing those flat washes and making it kind of feel seamless. But we're doing that background right now. So it's okay if there's like a strip of yellow green, a strip of light green, a strip of regular green. Like it's okay if there's variations, because we're going to be using that brush to do a dry brush of grass, right? So I'm just going to add a little more green here, that flat wash. Layering that up, right? So you can see I've got my lightest color going to my darkest color. Now, to do that individual grass, we're not going to draw one blade at a time. I mean, you can, and it'll look fantastic to do it that way, taking your time, really doing one blade of grass. But you can see here that that grass, it really is going in every direction. It's not all leaning the same way, right? It's kind of abstract in its marks, right? And so if we'll remember from doing techniques, those techniques, that the dry brush is where we have a mostly dry brush that we kind of spread out a little bit with our fingers and we make marks. So I have my dry brush here. And what I'm going to do is take my darkest dark. It's a dry brush, dip it in that wet color that I mixed. I'm just going to kind of spread it out a little bit and make those marks. So it's doing a little bit of those blades of grass, right? And so it's going in all sorts of directions, right? Just kind of bringing that grass, right? And so we can see that mark, that dry brush going in every direction. And that's how we get those individual pieces of grass. It's an illusion of individual pieces, right? But it's all about kind of fanning that out. So you can see here, it's kind of spread out. So it looks like it's individual blades here. If you have a fan brush, it's perfect for this because you're making those marks, grass marks. So once this wash, that background dries a little bit, you can start adding this type of dry brush on top of it, getting that layer of grass. And you can do different greens there, right? Because we can see with our grass that it's different shades of green. It's some of the lightest lights, the darkest darks, all of that there. You can also bring that sponge in to do some scumbling too, kind of in the same way we did our tree earlier, getting a little bit of that green on the sponge, right? Let's do a little bit of the green and then kind of bringing that in. So you get that grass looking. Okay, so there are a couple ways to kind of get that grass look, right? By using that brush, fanning it out, getting those individual marks, or by using that sponge and getting that kind of speckled look. I think some of the best paintings, right, are a combination of all those things. Mm. And so this is still a little wet, but once you get that flat wash and you start adding that grass in there, you can start layering it up, layering it up. And the truth is, this green will look different when it's dry. And so what I can do is do that same green again on top of it, and I'll get even darker spots and some more lighter spots. So even using that same, like if I use the same one over and over again, I'm still going to get a variation in color. To do like individual grass, you would need a small brush or like a detail brush. To do that individual blades of grass, it would just be doing that mark, pressing down like that. So you can see that little bit of mark making. You're using, again, you're using that very tip of your brush to make those marks. And the thing you want to pay attention to is that the grass is going in all sorts of directions. It's not just going in one direction. If you were to go outside now and look at your grass, any grass like on the sidewalk or in the park, you'll see that they're not all laying against each other. Like they're not all going that same direction. They really are kind of overlapping and spread out. And so I think that's one of the things to keep in mind anytime we're doing nature is not everything goes the same way. It's not all ordered. There is a little bit of chaos to it. That grass going in every direction, those leaves on the tree, they're not all laying flat in the same way. They're just kind of like all over. So thinking about keeping it a little chaotic is nice. So I've got my paper taped off, and you can see when I taped off my paper, I on one side, three sides, I put all the way on the edge, but on one side I moved it in just a little bit, and this is that color swatch, right? And so if you don't make enough of that pigment, then you can match colors when you need to blend it again. And the way to do that is make a color swatch on the same type of paper as you're painting. So if you had two pieces of paper, that's good. Usually I just use an edge of the paper I'm painting on. So if I'm bringing in these colors, what I'll do is take my brush, right, and just make those marks here. So I know that's my lightest color. This is my next lightest. And then gradually getting darker. So even if I um, don't have enough pigment, I need to make more. This way I can match it. So I know what color I'm looking for. So if you don't make enough, this is like a really great way to use your swatch paper. So now if I run out, I see I'm going to run out of my dark color, my darkest dark before the others. I have this over here now that I match it and know this is that dark shade that I'm looking for. And I'll be able to test it. All right, so let's take just a moment to kind of set up our landscape. So if we are doing a landscape here, kind of combining all the things that we've talked about so far, the best way to start is by kind of drawing it out a little bit. So I'm going to use some watercolor pencils. I'm going to pull out a brown and a green. And just as a reminder, I like using watercolor pencils for that drawing because I don't have to erase it. These watercolor pencils are water soluble. So once I add water to it, that pigment starts to blend in with the other pigment, which is nice. If you don't have watercolor pencils, you can use a regular pencil. You just remember to pick it, to erase it when you start putting that pigment on there. But it's still good to have that layout planned. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by figuring out where I want my tree. So let's say I want my tree kind of over here on the side. I'm going to take my pencil and just kind of lightly build it up. So if you're using a watercolor pencil, press lightly. I'm going to press a little harder just so it's a little easier to see on camera. But I'm just going to kind of build that trunk up a little bit. Now, this doesn't mean I have to stick to these lines, right? This is just kind of that guideline, a starting place, right? So this is kind of my starting place for my tree. So I'm going to take my green now, and I'm going to think about that grass. Think about that horizon where I want all my like layers of grass to be. So I'm going to start off by just kind of, again, I'm pressing harder so it's a little easier to see. Do kind of a ground line here, but I'm also going to do just kind of like a hill in the distance. So this is kind of my starting landscape, right? I'm also going to come back to my tree now that I have some of my trunk and branches drawn. And I'm just going to kind of make some marks about where I want that green to be. Just kind of helping me kind of set that up. So this is kind of that starting drawing for me where I'm laying out placement. Okay? So what I can start doing now is thinking about those flat washes, that wash to do that grass, right? And start with my tree and branches, right? So here's the thing to keep in mind as we're doing that whole landscape, that wherever the water is, that's where the pigment's going to go. So if you are starting with like your grass here, it may be smart to start with, to also start with the green leaves, right? Doing those washes there because they're not touching each other. So we don't have to worry about there being accidental blending. If you are doing the trunk, and you want to do the land, right? You want to make sure that the water rides right up against it, that the water is not touching in both of those, because you're going to get those bark colors blending with that grass, right? And so what I'm going to do to kind of start is just like gradually put together everything we've talked about, right? I'm going to start with my grass and I'm going to do that wash, right? So I'm going to take my brush here, and I'm using a flat brush for this one, but I'm just going to start right up against my tree and just kind of bring that green, that flat wash, right? And I'm doing a wet brush on a dry surface, right? So I'm doing that flat wash, that background. And I'm using my lightest color. I'm going to do the same here too. Just kind of pay attention to where I'm putting that brush, right? Because everywhere that water goes is where that pigment is going to go. Yep. And again, your drawing is going to, like if you're doing that watercolor pencil, you'll do a lighter mark. So it'll kind of blend more into your drawing, for sure. But we're doing that flat wash, right? That lightest color starting there. And we want that to dry before we start layering it up, okay? Right. So that flat wash helps us because if there is any grass that has any gaps in it, we won't have that white background now. We'll have that light green background, right? So you don't have to have that flat wash, but doing a wash on your paper is really helpful. So you can see I have my flat wash of green, but I want to encourage you to start building up that grass. We're gonna, like I said, we'll start with clouds and sky next week, so we'll be able to add that into our drawing. But work on your grass this week, building that up, just kind of like we talked about. This is that dark or that light green background, so I can come in with gradually making it darker and darker. And so I do want to say thank you everyone for being a part of today. Thank you so much. And if any questions come up, always feel free to jump in and ask or email us at our contact@Mather email or on our Facebook page. We're happy to answer as many questions as we can.